Hello, I'm Lynn Doyle. Thank you for joining us for Meet the Doctors, where each week we look at important health news, medical breakthroughs, and alternative therapies and how they may be impacting you and your family. Our aim is to explore the facts so that you can make educated decisions. Coming up today, we're delving into the heart of the matter. For the first time ever, doctors have been able to take a human heart that had stopped beating from a person who had died and bring it back to life and then transplant it into another human. It's like a page ripped from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. We'll talk to a leading cardiologist about the revolutionary procedure and its potential to save thousands of critically ill patients desperately waiting for a new heart. We'll also be joined by best-selling author, neurologist David Perlmutter. He will reveal some surprising truths about your brain. You see, he says the fate of your brain is not in your genes, it's actually in the food you eat. And of course, our panel of doctors will be here to answer your email questions. But first, this week's news. Have you ever sworn you've seen a ghost? Our obsession with ghostly apparitions in the form of humans or animals have been popularized for thousands of years in folklore, literature, and movies, as well as parodied.
Who you gonna call? Ghostbusters! Who you gonna call? Ghostbusters!
But scientists in Switzerland may have solved this haunting question, and it's what they long expected. Ghosts are just a figment of the imagination. This is how their experiment worked. While blindfolded, subjects insert their finger and push it around in the robot in front of them. That prompts the robot behind them to mimic the motion in real time using a pointer pressed against the subject's back. Now, none of the subjects knew that they were meant to experience anything spooky. But when the robot behind them was slightly out of sync, that's when things got creepy. Volunteers reported feeling as if someone was standing behind them. The scientists concluded that the illusion came from a programmed delay between the brain's processing of the body's movement. You might call it a trick of the brain. The device is otherwise used to understand conditions like schizophrenia and other neurological disorders. Medical balloons placed inside the stomach can trigger substantial weight loss without the need for invasive surgery, a new trial shows. 2 connected balloons filled with saline solution reduced stomach capacity and made people feel full. In the 6-month trial, those who had balloons inserted in their stomach lost 29 pounds compared to 11 pounds for those who dieted and exercised. That's more than double the weight loss. Doctors inserted the balloons through a scope, snaked down through the throat and into the stomach, and then filled them with saline. Now, although this technique has been available in Europe for a few years, the FDA has not approved it here in the U.S. Either way, the cost is a hefty $6,000. Well, we all know about man's best friend. Now scientists are adding new experimental drugs to pet food in the hopes that they may not only extend the lives of our dogs, but also help humans in the fight against cancer and heart disease. The anti-aging drug is being tested on large-sized dogs such as golden retrievers, Labradors, and German shepherds. The drug, rapamycin, is actually an anti-rejection drug for kidney transplant patients. It acts as a protein that is involved in cell growth, and it has an anti-inflammatory property. Researchers have found that it is possible to use stem cells to replace defective brain cells in victims of Parkinson's disease. The disorder is caused by the gradual loss of brain cells that produce the biochemical dopamine that helps regulate our movement and our emotional responses. Right now, there's no cure for Parkinson's disease, only drugs and treatments that ease the symptoms. What the Swedish study showed is it is possible to trigger human embryonic stem cells to produce a new generation of dopamine cells when transplanted into the brains of rats. That's because embryonic stem cells have the potential to become any cell of the body. Robin Williams was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease before he died in August. The comedian Jerry Seinfeld recently disclosed to NBC News anchor Brian Williams that he may have autism because of his struggles with social interaction, which is part of the autism spectrum disorder.
I think on a very drawn out scale, I think I'm on the spectrum.
autism advocates said the Funny Man's admission could help remove the stigma associated with the condition. For more on this, we go to our Newsmax Deputy Health Editor, Nick Tate. Nick, it's good to see you, and this must be good news for those people who deal with autism.
Absolutely true, Lynn. You know, you might say that Jerry Seinfeld is getting the ovation of his life for disclosing that he may have autism. But what's extraordinary here is not just that he said he struggles with some of the hallmarks of autism, like the social awkwardness that many feel, but that he thinks of it not so much as a dysfunctional disorder, but as a quote-unquote alternate mindset. Now, autism advocates say that Seinfeld's disclosure could, of course, destigmatize autism, but it could also send a really positive message that people with autism are more numerous and diverse than you might think. Now, just imagine what this might mean to an autistic person who goes to school or to work, knowing that everyone around him or her have heard that somebody like Jerry Seinfeld has this condition. Now, that's got to do wonders for your self-esteem and help to build a greater tolerance for autism. Now, to be clear, we need to point out that autism does exist on a spectrum. On the one end, there are high-functioning individuals like Seinfeld, but on the other are those who have very severe disabilities that require round-the-clock care. But it seems to me that Seinfeld's courageous revelation is yet another step toward destigmatizing mental health conditions that strike millions of Americans and their families, Lynn.
You know, Nick, before he always made us laugh, and now he is doing something even more positive in helping all of those millions who deal with it. Thanks so much for telling us about it. And coming up next, wheat, carbs, and sugar. Are these your brain's silent killers? You want to stay with us and find out. Meet the Doctors continues right after this. Welcome back to Meet the Doctors. I'm Lynn Doyle. So could the foods you eat actually protect you from getting Alzheimer's, or could they be causing you to get it? That's just one of the questions that we'll be answering in this next segment. To get those answers, we're joined by Dr. David Perlmutter. He is a neurologist and a best-selling author. His latest book is called Grain Brain, and with it, the companion, The Grain Brain Cookbook. He's joining us by Skype from Florida. Doctor, thank you so much for being with us.
Glad to be here and glad to be in Florida right now, I have to tell you.
Well, I have to say that your book definitely got my attention, particularly the subtitle that says, The Surprising Truth About Wheat, Carbs, and Sugar, Your Brain's Silent Killers. Is that true? Could we be killing ourselves by ingesting those three foods?
Well, it is true. I mean, I didn't write a book just because I had some ideas. That book is based upon over 200 peer-reviewed scientific references that really clearly delineate the notion, for example, that the carbohydrates in our diet, the sugar in our diet, is absolutely leading to almost every conceivable degenerative condition that you don't want to get, including Alzheimer's, heart disease, diabetes, and even cancer. So it's very real, but at the same time, it's very empowering to know that when you eliminate those things, you can pave the way for better health and build a brain that's resistant to those dreaded diseases.
Well, obviously we all want to do that, but I feel a bit conflicted, a bit confused as a consumer, because I've been hearing that eating grains, and particularly wheat, is good for me for many years. So are you saying that quite the opposite is true?
Well, I would ask you a simple question. Who have you been hearing that from?
The media, the diets.
There you go. And in fact, that is the wrong answer. You know, even our Food and Drug Administration and the agricultural concerns in Washington, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, for example, that has given us this wonderful food pyramid. And what was the base of that food pyramid? It was grains, whole grain breads and cookies and you name it. And that's really what people were told to do. And at the same time, we were told we had to eliminate fat from our diet. And it turns out that that's the wrong recommendation for two reasons. Number one, there's no shred of science that supports it. And number two, that's a diet unlike anything humans have ever eaten in our 2 million years on this planet. Now suddenly we're scientizing our food and telling people to eat foods that are like whole grains that have a dramatic effect in terms of raising blood sugar, and that is toxic for the brain.
So tell me what I should look for in my food pantry when I go home today that I should immediately remove.
Well, most of the food in your food pantry should be thrown away, basically. I think the only thing in a pantry, in other words, that's not refrigerated, that would be reasonable, would be the extra virgin olive oil, and perhaps some of the spices and the condiments would be okay. But by and large, you want to favor low carbohydrate, nutrient dense, above ground vegetables, kale, collards, broccoli, Brussels sprouts. And then if you choose to eat meat, it should be grass-fed beef, not meat, not animals that have been given a wheat that's been treated with who knows what, animals that have been given antibiotics and growth hormone, and feed that has been treated with herbicides, for example, like glyphosate. There's no alchemy that happens, garbage in, garbage out. You know, we eat what we eat eats, meaning when you eat an animal that's eating garbage, you're consuming garbage. So you've got to be very careful about the food that you eat. And here's the news for you. And that is that the food you eat matters in terms of your health. And you know, you had a piece earlier about stem cell therapy for Parkinson's. I was very intrigued that you were talking about that. Turns out that right now, as you and I are having this conversation, you are experiencing stem cell therapy in your brain. We grow new brain cells every moment of our lives, and we can stimulate that by eating foods that have less calories and by taking, for example, the omega-3 that's called DHA, and getting aerobic exercise. We have a chance to grow back our memory center, to grow new brain cells, in other words, to increase stem cell therapy right now, right this minute.
Well, I'm all for that, and I like the idea of the aerobic exercise, but I know that there are people who are watching who are going to say, listen, I have eaten this kind of food my whole life. It's too late for me. What would you say to them? Is it actually possible to turn back time, so to speak, and make corrections?
You know, it's not that your guest on your program is telling you that it's possible. It's what the science has proven. In a really incredible study appearing in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, researchers from the University of Pittsburgh demonstrated that, in fact, elderly individuals had a dramatic ability to grow new brain cells, number one, and to regain memory function when they did simple aerobic exercise. But at the same time, you want to maximize the program, get your blood sugar down, and give your brain back what it desperately needs, and that is fat. Good fats, obviously, not modified trans fats, but good fats. They're good for your brain. They're good for your heart. They're good for your immune system. They'll help you lose weight. Think of what I'm saying.
Yeah, for you to say to
and
include fats, that will actually help you lose weight, I think has people like stopping and saying, tell me more, tell me more.
Well, again, this isn't news. This was first published in the Journal of the American Medical Association back in 2007. So we're talking about 7 years ago when this was first published. That's called the A to Z trial, and we've known it ever since. The idea of going on a low-fat diet or a no-fat diet is absolutely a diet that is bad for you. It'll help you gain weight. It increases inflammation, like you talked about earlier, in terms of heart disease.
Right.
And we want to cut the carbs. It's the carbs that increase inflammation, that damage our protein, that increase the action of chemicals called free radicals that actually damage our DNA. So this is a diet that humans have never eaten. We've never eaten carbohydrates like we are doing now. Grain Brain is really kind of the take-home message as to how to implement a plan to reverse brain degeneration right now, today, and actually to pave the way for brain health in moving forward. Alzheimer's is a disease for which we have no treatment, but yet it is a disease that is preventable. And you know, when you see the hundreds of millions of dollars that are being spent to seek out a cure for Alzheimer's at a time when we know that it's preventable, it's beyond being a head scratcher. You really got to wonder, what are people thinking? Well, it's because you can monetize a cure. You can't really monetize prevention.
Well, if people want more information, I encourage them to read this book. It's called The Green Brain, and it also has a companion cookbook along with it. Dr. Perlmutter, you have given us a lot to think about. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge
Great.
with us here on Meet the Doctors.
My pleasure.
Good to see you. We do have to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll be talking about the so-called heart in a box. Could this new breakthrough procedure be the next step for critically ill heart patients who are waiting for a medical miracle? We'll find out. Almost 47 years ago, South African doctor Christopher Barnard made history performing the first human heart transplant. The patient, Louis Washkansky, was a 54-year-old grocer, and he survived the operation and lived for 18 days. But it was a milestone nonetheless. Just recently, doctors made another medical breakthrough. They were actually able to revive and then transplant a heart that had stopped beating for 20 minutes. Thousands of critically ill patients are on a long list for donor hearts. So could this shorten the wait? Let's go once again to Nick Tate for more information. Nick, what a breakthrough.
Exactly right, Lynn. You know, it really does sound like something out of Shelley's Frankenstein, reviving a dead heart long after it had stopped beating. But in fact, that's exactly what this team of Australian surgeons have done. They were able to take 3 hearts that had stopped beating for about 20 minutes, resuscitate them, and transplant them into 3 other people. The technique involves donor hearts being placed into a portable machine that they call a heart in a box. The device contains a preservative that keeps the hearts warm and allows them to be reanimated and then transplanted into patients literally hours after they had stopped beating. It's pretty amazing stuff. The doctor said you can even watch the dead hearts revive in this portable machine and start beating again. Now, in the first 3 cases, the donor hearts came from different hospitals and were kept beating during transport times of between 5 and 8 hours. So the technique is a huge leap forward for heart transplants and is likely to change how organs are donated. Until now, transplants always use the still beating hearts of donors who have been declared brain dead, which of course greatly reduces the number of procedures you can do. But this new approach could allow surgeons to do up to 30% more transplants, meaning that the 4,000 Americans that are now on heart wait lists might not have to wait quite so long.
All right, Nick Tate, thank you very much. We appreciate that report. We're joined now to get more information by cardiologist Dennis Goodman. He is the Director of Integrative Medicine at NYU Langone Medical Center and also a native South African as well. Must be very proud of these latest developments that started 47 years ago with the great Dr. Christopher Barnard.
It's very exciting, and it really does take me back to 1967 when there was this incredible breakthrough. The first human heart transplant, and the excitement, you know, throughout the world. It was a breakthrough, and this is, although it's not as well known, I think a lot of people don't even know about it. It's also incredibly exciting because it changes the way we may be able to help people.
Nick just explained to us the actual procedure of taking a dead heart, reviving it using the blood of the donor, and keeping it alive in a box before it's then resuscitated and put into a living patient. You have a prop here of a human heart. Can you explain to us what needs to be done to resuscitate a heart that was previously declared dead?
So I think one thing we should point out is what makes this so different from what we're doing now. When a patient is declared brain dead, that means they can no longer survive. That heart in that body is still alive, and it's kept going, right? You know, the heart's beating inside the body, and then that heart is taken out and put on ice. And it's put on ice, and while it's on ice, it's waiting to go into the recipient. But during the time that it's on ice, it's actually decaying, as it were. And there's only a certain amount of time, up to 4 hours, after which you can't use it anymore. And so now the whole idea is that you can take a heart, which is incredible what they did. These are people that are really risk takers, being prepared to do something that goes against what we all thought. We thought when the heart's dead and it's not pumping, it's going to die and you'll never be able to use it. So they're taking the heart out even after it's stopped beating for up to 20 minutes in these cases, and then they hook it up to something called a heart in the box. So this heart then gets into a solution, and the donor, the recipient blood, the donor blood, the recipient blood goes around and keeps this heart going. And then you hook up tubes, and the heart is perfused with blood and oxygen. And it starts beating, which is kind of a miracle. It's not like you have to shock it. It starts beating itself. And then we can look at that heart. Remember, they have to make absolutely sure that this heart's going to be healthy.
This is literally the future of heart care.
I'm going to say yes and no, because you know when something new comes out, we have to prove it. These are 2 cases. I think there are 3 now. And it was done in Australia, and everybody's very excited. But we have to test it. We have to show that patients are going to survive. We've got to have some long-term survival. It's got to be better than, and today, I think the longest transplant is patients 28 years. So we have a very successful procedure. We have to make sure that it's going to be successful. You don't want a heart that they say, well, turns out these hearts pack up after 5 years. So I'm sure the FDA will be very strict about when we can do this in this country.
Right.
But if we are allowed to do it, and if it becomes something that's clearly going to be successful, it's huge. And what it means is there's going to be so many more hearts available.
And that's what I was thinking, that 47 years ago, when Dr. Barnard did the first human heart transplant, no one thought that nearly 50 years in the future, it would be somewhat routine medical procedures all around the world. So who knows where this will be
Absolutely. And
in
that's
30 or 40 years.
We have to take our hats off to people that are prepared to do this, because these are people that are really maybe changing the way we do things and saving many more lives. I think you saw from Nick, 4,000 people, waiting for a heart transplant. And many of them dying before they can get the heart transplant. Even when you have devices like LVADs, and we have artificial types of hearts that can help a heart pump while you're waiting for a transplant, but many people die while they're waiting for a transplant. And here's the real opportunity for this. You could have a heart, theoretically, that could come from somewhere else,
Right.
say in the United States, and you could just keep it beating
Until
and
you
bring
can
it
get it
here.
to its
Whereas
recipient.
if you're in California, say, and you put a heart on ice, and 4 hours goes by, you can't use that heart. And that's where we may be able to have a lot more donor hearts available.
Well, what I want to talk to you about, and I know that you're going to stay with us for our Meet the Doctors panel, is how we can keep our hearts healthy. So I want to talk about that and
my
much more,
favorite
and answer
topic.
all of your questions when we come back. But we do take a short break, and we'll return with Meet the Doctors right after this. Welcome back to Meet the Doctors. This is the part of our show where you do actually get to meet the doctors. We put together a panel of experts, and they very graciously answer the questions that you've sent us via email. We certainly do appreciate all of your interest, and we try to answer as many as we can each week. Dr. Goodman has stayed here with us. As you know, he's the cardiologist that we were just speaking to, and we're joined now by his colleague, Dr. Ravi Rajmani, who is a pulmonologist who practices critical care medicine at NYU. It's good to have you with us.
Great to be back, Lynn. Thank
He
you.
is a frequent guest on our show and answers all of your questions in such a great manner. And of course, Dr. Goodman, this is the opportunity now for you to answer some questions, including one from our very own Nick Tate, who pointed out to me that 20 people in this country a day die while waiting for a transplant. Not just a heart transplant, but a transplant. Would this heart in a box inspire perhaps other scientists to create a heart in a box, a kidney in a box, a liver in a box? Does it really spell, hope for all these people who are facing death daily?
I think the answer is yes. It's very exciting. Anytime you can have an organ in its, I call it the natural environment, it's going to be better than taking it out and putting it on ice. So if we have organs that, even if there's been death to the organ as such, but we can resuscitate it. It can be alive and get it going again. Then it's very, very exciting. It will mean that there's many, many more opportunities to get organs, because all we got to do is actually get them back to getting blood flow, and we can actually use them. So I think that Nick's absolutely right. I think that could turn out to be something not only for patients waiting heart transplantation, but all organs.
People at home are concerned about heart health because, as you know, it kills so many people every year. So let's talk a little bit about what we can do to make sure that we're keeping our hearts as healthy as they possibly can be.
Right, and for good reason. It turns out that heart disease is still the #1 killer for men and women. 1 in 2 women actually die of heart disease. And it's very scary. Women are very focused on breast cancer. They get their mammograms, but they don't realize their greatest risk is actually the heart. So it's very, very important. And the other thing about the heart is that, unfortunately, half the patients who die of heart disease, it's their first and last symptom. So it's silent. Can be silent for a very long time, and you don't know you've got heart disease. So it's extremely important to get checked out, to know what your risk factors are. And to answer your question, when I talk to patients, there are 4 things that I think are crucial: nutrition, exercise and flexibility, stress management, and sleep.
Now, I know that we give a lot of attention to the heart, particularly because the numbers are stunning, both with men and women, in terms of heart disease. How important are the lungs, and should we be paying as much attention to them?
So it's interesting, when Dr. Goodman talks about heart health, he really speaks about endothelial, or what we call vascular health, and certainly the vasculature, what is composed of blood vessels. The building blocks also are important in lung health. For example, pulmonary vasculature is very important. So certainly the lungs and heart are interplay and intertwined with each other. And these recommendations that Dr. Goodman is giving is also very beneficial for lung health.
We have a question actually about smoking that I think segues nicely
Sure.
here from one of our viewers. Says, I've read that smoking could be linked to bladder cancer and back pain. Is it something to worry about even if I describe myself as an occasional smoker?
So that's a great question. And so bladder cancer is intimately associated with smoking. In fact, most smokers, or most folks who get bladder cancer, are former or current smokers. And most folks don't realize that smoking is a significant risk factor. Certainly active smokers are aware of their risks, and that bladder cancer is more likely to develop in active smokers. But if you've ever smoked and you have any urinary problems, any blood in your urine, I think you should get checked for bladder cancer or urinary cancers. Don't smoke, folks. That's the bottom line.
Then I'm going to use my little model to show you something. You know, you're born with this beautiful artery. The lining is very smooth and clean, and smoking damages the lining, and so you've no longer got the protections. It's just the most, terrible thing that you can do to your arteries. And as you get damage to that area, you get plaque starts to develop, and eventually you'll end up with this.
Oh.
So what you're trying to do is keep your pipes nice and clean. So smoking is really, it's a toxin that damages that wall.
So I just want to point out that that was very nice and clear and open, and then it was very closed up and yellow and disgusting and gross. So you don't want to be yellow and disgusting and gross. All right, another question about the heart. Will a daily low dose of aspirin really help my arrhythmia? If so, what is the recommended dosage to take, and which is better, buffered or just plain aspirin?
So obviously the question there is, what's the arrhythmia? An arrhythmia means an irregular heart rhythm. It's important that you know what it is. You have to see your doctor, because there's certain rhythms that actually are more serious, something called atrial fibrillation, where the atria are not contracting properly. That puts you at risk from blood clots inside the heart. In fact, I've got my model here. I'll show you where they develop, right up here in these chambers called the atria. And they can actually come dislodge from here and go to the brain and cause a stroke. So anticoagulation in that arrhythmia is extremely important. Aspirin is not great for that. You've got to see somebody and be in proper blood thinners. What about aspirin as a preventative? It turns out that, unfortunately, if it was completely safe, it would be fine. It causes gastric problems. And in a big study called the Doctor's Heart Study, they actually had more people getting hemorrhagic strokes. So aspirin is very important for anybody with diagnosed heart disease. But in prevention, it's still a murky area.
You know,
Okay, I have to take a short break, but I'm going to suggest that everyone have a heart model like this in your home, because if you saw how your heart really needs to work, you would make changes. We're going to take a quick break. We'll have more of your answers to more of your questions right after this. Before the break, we were talking about arrhythmias and whether or not aspirin is a good preventative maintenance kind of procedure. And I know Dr. Rajmani wanted to jump in on that because it's not necessarily the best course of action.
Right, right. And sort of, I'm going to act as though I'm the cardiologist here and elbow out Dr. Goodman. But certainly, we both know that arrhythmias, besides atrial fibrillation, can be devastating, particularly if they're ventricular arrhythmias or even supraventricular arrhythmias. Those are not really managed or prevented by aspirin. Aspirin really sort of attends to the risk for ischemic or coronary artery disease, or it has a role possibly in atrial fibrillation, which I think Dr. Goodwin pointed out is very poor. But for other types of arrhythmia, you know, have those checked and get on appropriate treatment. Aspirin is not the right thing. Only aspirin is not right.
I'm going to
Thank
go
you,
back.
but just so we don't leave anybody, aspirin is not a treatment for atrial fibrillation in terms of preventing strokes. It's not good. So it's very important, if you've got an arrhythmia, find out what it is and get the right treatment. But I
Okay,
agree
back
with
to
you.
our viewer questions. My doctor wants me to go for a stress test for my heart, even though I don't have any problems, although I do take a statin. He says he just wants to be sure he hasn't missed anything. Is this really necessary? By the way, I'm 55.
Yeah, I love that question because it's so important that people understand what a stress test is. A stress test is when you go on the treadmill or you go on the bicycle and the heart rate is forced to increase because you're exercising. And what we're actually able to pick up and screen for is an obstruction in the coronary artery. Now, these are the coronary arteries. You realize this is what supplies blood to our heart, and we need them to be nice and open like this. But when you get obstruction like this, and if it's 70% or more, you're likely to have what we call ischemia, not enough oxygen to the heart muscle. And it comes out because the heart rate's up, so your heart requires more oxygen. And we pick up people with what we call obstructive coronary artery disease. Well, it turns out most heart attacks occur in people who don't have obstructive coronary artery disease. So it's no good to say, well, I passed my stress test, I should be fine. Not at all. You can have plaque like this, right? And you'll pass the stress test. So the question is, should you do a stress test? The stress test is not indicated in the absence of symptoms. Okay, because normally when you've got 70% obstruction, you will start having symptoms. You will get chest pain with exertion, you will get shortness of breath. So the guidelines are very clear that you only need to do a stress test is when we're trying to ascertain what is the cause of the chest pain or the shortness of breath, because then it's very, very helpful.
I'm sure that you've heard these stories before, and our viewers have questions about them as well, where an individual goes to see the doctor does the test or does the, the health exam, says, oh, you're great, you're in great health. Person goes home and within a week they drop dead of a heart attack. How does that happen?
So you're speaking, I think, of the idea of plaque rupture, a stable plaque. And I think Dr. Goodman can speak to this. Certainly the stress test will pick somebody who's at risk for plaque rupture, so that, again, sort of highlights the roles of good cardiovascular health, blood pressure control, recognizing your lipid profile if that places you at risk, and other nutritional factors like diabetes.
I'm going to grab my model again, just like Ravi said, because I really brought this because this illustrates exactly what you're asking me. Here you see an artery nice and clean in the beginning, like I spoke about. You start to develop this lipid pool. This is obstruction, this is plaque, and it starts to block the artery. Okay, but you see over here in this particular section here, this artery is only about 50% blocked. But you can see here, this is what Ravi's talking about. This is called plaque rupture. So even if it's not obstructive, it can rupture, and then when the inside, the lipids here get in contact with blood, you get thrombus, which is blood clot. And this is what's causing a heart attack. So I want you to realize, this artery is now occluded, but it's occluded with blood clot. And that's why people suddenly, unfortunately, drop dead because they get plaque rupture. They're not aware they've got plaques. And it can happen at any time. And he made an excellent point, Ravi, that who are the people at risk? You've got to go to the physician and say, what are my risks for this? And we now live in a time, we are extremely fortunate because we can assess whether people have plaques. We have studies and tests today where you can actually find that out.
We have people at home saying, I'm calling the doctor in the morning to see whether I can get a stress test and a plaque test. Okay. We have a few other questions before we bring our show to a close for this week, so let's try to get to as many as possible. Can drinking alcohol daily be a reason for my shortness of breath? Please say no.
Well, of course, so alcohol can be beneficial, certainly for heart health. And of course, as your grandmother, as your Donna says, anything in moderation. So we know, of course, that the lower esophageal sphincter, so I don't have a model for this, but your stomach is sort of, it's pursed off by the esophagus in this shoestring sort of fashion. And things that can open it include alcohol, caffeine, and certainly if you drink a lot of alcohol and you have a lot of regurgitant gastric acid, particularly at night, particularly when you're flat, can spill over into your airways and cause shortness of breath. Okay. That's the most direct mechanism.
Okay.
Can I tackle that for 1 second? I think it's really important people realize that alcohol in excess can actually cause the heart muscle to get weak. And you can actually have something called an alcoholic cardiomyopathy. It can cause heart failure. In general, you can drink alcohol in moderation. And I tell my patients on 2 conditions. 1, you're not trying to lose weight because it's full of calories. And number 2, you don't have alcoholism in your family. Because for me, those groups of people, the benefits do not outweigh the risk.
Okay, keep that in mind. Now, I do have to ask Dr. Goodman a question about magnesium because you have written a book called Magnificent Magnesium. How important is it to our daily health?
So, I am a big believer in magnesium. I've really researched it, and I've discovered that 80% of Americans are actually magnesium deficient. Magnesium, 80%?
Wow.
And the reason is you find magnesium in green leafy vegetables, like kale and spinach, and then almonds, pumpkin seeds, halibut. Most people don't eat these things.
I was just going to say.
So
sounds good.
Yeah,
Why are all the things that taste so good so bad for us, and all the things that are good for us aren't really all that appealing?
And what I found in my practice, when somebody says to me, oh, I'm eating that, I'm fine, and I measure the level of magnesium, they're still deficient because the soil is deficient. So in a nutshell, just let me say that there are about 350 enzyme systems that require magnesium to work. All the cells in the body require magnesium to function properly. So if you're low in magnesium, common symptoms are fatigue, palpitations, you're at risk from heart disease, diabetes, obesity. Really, people should be aware that it's extremely important to make sure your magnesium levels are in a good range, and the best test is a red blood cell magnesium.
I was just going to say, is it a blood test? How do we address this with our doctors quickly?
This is actually, Dennis is probably making a very provocative point, which is that most physicians don't know how to measure magnesium adequately. Certainly we have standard blood tests, but I think what you're saying is that there's a more sensitive way. And certainly, and just as an aside, so I can talk about the lungs, magnesium is also beneficial for bronchospasm. So patients who come in with an asthma attack, we administer magnesium as well. But do you want to speak about
No, I think what's very important, there are many things like high blood pressure. You can actually bring the blood pressure down with magnesium.
Good.
And you don't need to be on blood pressure medication. So I think it's something you bring up with your doctor. And of course, if you read my book, you'll learn all about it.
And the book is called Magnificent Magnesium. Thank you so much, Dr. Goodman, who also sees patients at NYU Men's Center and Preventative Medicine Program. Good to have you with us. I hope you'll come back. Dr. Rajamani, always a pleasure to have you.
My pleasure, Lynn. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for all of your great questions that started these wonderful discussions. Until the next time, we hope that you stay happy and healthy. I'm Lynn Doyle from Meet the Doctors.